On the evening of June 23, 1859, at Riverwood Plantation in Orangeburg County, South Carolina, Master Edward Blackwood was hosting the most distinguished dinner party of the social season. 17 guests had assembled to commemorate Blackwood's recent appointment to the state legislature. At precisely 8:47 p.m., just as the main course was being served, a low hum began to emanate from the walls. Within minutes, the gathering erupted into chaos as thousands of paper wasps poured from nests that had been developing inside the walls over the preceding 8 months. By 9:15 p.m., 11 people were dead, with 6 more succumbing in the days that followed. This was no unfortunate accident. An enslaved woman named Delilah, a 43-year-old master carpenter, had orchestrated the entire event. This is her account. 9 months earlier, in September 1858, Delilah had been forced to witness Master Blackwood beat her 15-year-old daughter, Grace, to death with a fireplace poker, the offense spilling tea on his ledger. The beating lasted 7 agonizing minutes. Held down by overseers, Delilah was compelled to watch as her daughter's skull fractured. When it was over, Blackwood ordered Delilah to clean up the blood, remarking that she should be grateful he didn't sell her for raising such a clumsy child. Delilah wiped her daughter's blood from the floor, wrapped the body, and buried Grace. In that moment, something inside her perished, and something far more dangerous was conceived. Riverwood Plantation spanned 400 acres and held 193 enslaved people in Orangeburg County, South Carolina. Edward Blackwood, 51, had inherited the estate in 1845. Over 14 years he had cultivated political connections, culminating in his recent election to the state legislature. The June 23rd dinner was his victory lap, his formal entry into Carolina's elite circles. His wife Margaret, 47, managed the household slaves with cold efficiency. Overseer Jacob Thornton, 42, was notorious for his brutality. Beneath him were 3 drivers, enslaved men who enforced the rules on their own people. This was Delilah's world. Born in 1816 in Virginia, she was the daughter of Isaac, a master carpenter, who secretly taught her his trade from the age of 6. When Isaac was sold to Louisiana in 1828, Delilah had already absorbed years of training. She understood buildings, structures, and hidden spaces. Purchased by Blackwood's uncle in 1832 for $4,800, she endured 27 years of slavery, bore 4 children, and watched 3 of them be sold away. The 4th was Grace, until that September day, until the tea, until the poker, until those 7 minutes destroyed everything. After burying Grace, Delilah entered a state of cold calculation. She resolved to kill Blackwood, Margaret Thornton, and as many of their wealthy associates as possible at the celebration dinner she knew was being planned. But her method had to be untraceable, appear accidental, and strike all targets simultaneously. She needed to turn the mansion itself into a weapon. Then, she remembered the Wasps. In September 1858, Delilah had been repairing exterior walls when she disturbed a paper wasp nest. The wasps attacked furiously, stinging her face and arms, chasing her 50 yards before giving up. Later, after the pain subsided, she returned to study the nest. Paper wasps constructed remarkable structures from chewed wood fibers. Their nests housed hundreds of individuals. They were aggressive defenders. They could be provoked into coordinated attacks, and they could be manipulated. Delilah studied obsessively for 3 weeks wasp behavior, nest building patterns, ideal locations. She realized that if she could encourage wasps to build inside the mansion's walls and control when the nests were disturbed, she could create a coordinated assault involving thousands of wasps. The mansion would become a trap. As plantation carpenter, she had everything she needed, unrestricted access to every room for maintenance. The dinner was scheduled for June 23, 1859, 9 months away. She possessed the knowledge to execute a plan no one would suspect. She began in October 1858. Step 1. Prepare infrastructure. Riverwood Mansion. A three-story Greek Revival structure built in 1838 had walls constructed with 8 to 12-inch cavities between exterior brick and interior plaster. Perfect for wasp nests. Delilah created access points throughout small openings in walls covered with removable panels, connecting to the exterior through gaps in the brickwork. Her control points. She positioned 17 locations, 8 in the dining room walls, 4 in the parlor, 3 in the hallway, and 2 in the foyer. Each vent opened directly into a nest location. Step 2. To attract wasps. Paper wasps. Pellicets required wood fiber for nest construction. Delilah ground weathered cedar and pine into pulp and placed it inside the wall cavities. She adjusted ventilation holes, enlarging some and creating others, always with plausible explanations. By November, 17 sites were prepared. Step 3. Establish colonies. In December, wasp queens sought winter shelter. Delilah actively collected sluggish queens on cold mornings, capturing them carefully and introducing 23 queens into the 17 prepared locations inside the walls. Not all would survive, but enough would. By February 1859, the queens emerged and began building. Delilah heard soft rustling inside the walls. By March, colonies were established and growing. By April, there were 50 to 100 wasps per nest. By May, populations exploded to 200 to 500 per nest. As June approached, peak wasp activity was imminent, with colonies at their largest and most defensive. The timing was perfect for the June 23rd dinner. But Delilah needed a trigger mechanism. Step 4. Create a trigger system. Inside the wall cavities behind the panels, Delilah constructed wooden hammers on long handles. Ropes connected all the hammers to a central point in the attic. One pull would make all hammers strike the wall simultaneously, enraging the wasps and driving them out through the prepared vents. She tested the connections meticulously. Step 5. Prepare exit points. The wasps needed to emerge in the rooms where the targets were gathered. Delilah created disguised vents covered with decorative metal grills. When the wasps were triggered, the vents would open from inside the walls. 8 vents in the dining room were hidden behind curtains and frames, 4 in the parlor, 3 in the hallway, and 2 in the foyer. Each vent opened directly into a nest location. Step 6. Maximize casualties. Wasps killed through allergic reactions and the sheer overwhelming number of stings. Delilah studied the guest list, which included 20 people total. She observed for signs of insect allergies, noting that 3 had bad reactions to stings, but she also needed sheer numbers. She maintained optimal conditions, all spring ideal temperatures, water access, and even dead insects as protein sources. By June, everything was complete. The mechanism was ready, the nests were thriving, and only the timing remained. Step 7. Choreograph the attack. The dinner was scheduled for 7:30 p.m., with guests arriving between 700 and 7:30, gathering in the parlor for drinks, and moving to the dining room around 8:00. The main course would be served around 8:45 p.m., her window. Everyone would be seated, enclosed in the dining room, surrounded by wasp nests in the walls. She would trigger the attack during the main course when the targets were focused, relaxed, and trapped in their chairs. Timing 8:47 p.m. exactly. From trigger to first wasp 30 seconds. To full swarm 2 minutes. To deaths 10 to 15 minutes. The entire event would be over in 20 minutes. June 23rd arrived. Clear skies, warm temperatures. Perfect. Delilah woke at 4:30 a.m. as usual, following her normal routine. At 2:00 p.m., she inspected the mansion structure and checked the trigger system. Everything was perfect. The guests arrived at 6:50 p.m., carriages rolling up. Wealthy planters, politicians, merchants, people who had built their fortunes on enslaved labor. They would be dead within 3 hours. By 7:20 p.m., all 17 guests had arrived and were gathered in the parlor for drinks. Blackwood held court, discussing his political plans. At 7:59 p.m., dinner was called. 20 people were seated around the mahogany table. The first course was served at 18:05 p.m., soup brought in by silent house slaves. Delilah was assigned to serve the main course. Perfect. She needed access to the attic anyway, and being a server gave her a legitimate reason to be inside. The main course was prepared by 18:40 p.m. SAR, roasted duck, vegetables, sauces. Delilah and 3 others carried the platters, beginning to serve at 8:42 p.m. Delilah served Blackwood. He didn't acknowledge her. She served Margaret. Receiving no recognition, she moved around the table, serving guests who laughed and consumed their meals. At 8:46 p.m., all plates were filled. Everyone was distracted. Perfect. Delilah returned to the kitchen and informed the cook that she needed to check the ceiling beams for creaking. The cook barely listened. Delilah slipped into the mansion through the servants' entrance and climbed the servants' stairs to the attic. She reached the trigger point at 8:46. She heard the dinner party below, laughter, conversation, silverware clinking. She thought of Grace, the tea spilling, the poker, cleaning the blood. She gripped the rope. This was for Grace. For every enslaved child sold away. For every person beaten, raped, or killed. This was justice she pulled. The hammers struck simultaneously. 17 impacts inside the wall cavities. For 3 seconds there was nothing. Then buzzing. Low at first, rising rapidly. Then screaming. The exit vents opened at head height. When the wasps emerged, they came out at face level. Paper wasps can sting multiple times, and they are aggressive when defending their nests. Delilah had disturbed 17 nests at once. Thousands of enraged wasps poured through the vents into the dining room. Initial confusion. The buzzing was so sudden that people didn't understand what was happening. Then the first stings landed, and panic erupted. Blackwood stood, knocking his chair backward. What the hell? Wasps covered his face. He screamed and swatted, which only agitated the wasps further. They stung his eyes, nose, and mouth. Margaret shrieked and tried to run, but there were wasps in the hallway, too. She made it 5 steps before the swarm caught her, going down as her airway closed. Thornton drew his pistol and fired twice, but wasps covered his gun hand. He dropped the weapon, ran to the window, smashed through it, and fell 8 feet to the ground. The wasps followed. Complete chaos ensued. Some tried the parlor, but there were wasps there. Others tried the foyer, with more wasps. A few crawled under the table, but the wasps were everywhere. Swarming in the thousands, the sound was indescribable: screaming, buzzing, furniture crashing, glass breaking. Bedlam. Delilah watched from the attic window. She saw people stumbling out, covered in wasps, their faces swelling. She saw Thornton on the ground, not moving, the wasp still attacking. She saw someone collapse on the steps, convulsing. The plan was working exactly as designed. She waited 5 minutes. The screaming diminished. At 8:59 p.m., she calmly descended, walked through the kitchen, and told the workers that something terrible had happened. Wasps were everywhere, and they should run to their quarters. She didn't run. She walked, crossed the yard with measured steps, entered her cabin, sat in the darkness, and waited. The aftermath was catastrophic. Of the 20 people in the mansion, 11 died that night. Blackwood at 9:07 p.m. from anaphylactic shock, combined with over 300 stings. His face was unrecognizable. Margaret at 9:23 p.m., her throat completely closed, suffocated. Thornton at 9:45 p.m., from massive trauma from both stings and the fall. 5 guests died between 9:15 and 10:30 p.m. from allergic reactions and sting trauma. 3 more were injured during the panic. Broken neck, cardiac arrest, head trauma. and 6 survived initially, but 3 died over the following days from infection. The final death toll was 17. The survivors couldn't explain what had happened. The walls had exploded with wasps, thousands at once, as if they had been waiting inside. An investigation began immediately. The sheriff arrived at midnight and examined the mansion in confusion. Wasp nests were discovered in the wall's 17 colonies, with hundreds of wasps in each. But how had the attack been simultaneous? How had the nests been built without anyone noticing? Delilah was questioned along with all the enslaved people. She maintained perfect composure. "I don't know about wasps, sir. I work repairs, but I never saw any. Maybe through cracks. Old houses get infested." It was plausible. The mansion was 21 years old, and wasps were common in South Carolina. The sheriff examined the cavities, found the nest sites, but not the trigger mechanism. The ropes looked like building material. He found the exit vents, but assumed they were original architectural features. Nothing suggested deliberate human involvement. The official conclusion was death by natural causes, a wasp infestation causing a mass attack, with no evidence of human involvement. A tragic accident, but suspicions lingered. Wasps don't organize mass attacks spontaneously. 17 nests were suspicious. The simultaneous assault was too coordinated. Whispers of enslaved involvement, voodoo, African magic, circulated, but there was no proof. The enslaved community, however, knew the truth. They knew Delilah's daughter had been murdered. They knew she had access to the structure. They knew the timing was too perfect. They celebrated quietly. Justice had been done. 3 weeks later, the Blackwood estate was sold. Enslaved people were sold to various buyers. Delilah was purchased by a Georgia planter for $600, as her carpenter skills were valuable. She lived for 18 more years, dying in 1877 at age 61. She never spoke publicly about the incident. But in the quarters, when whites weren't listening, she told the story, how she had prepared the walls, cultivated the colonies, timed everything, pulled the trigger, and walked away while 17 died. The story spread through the underground network and became a legend. The carpenter who turned a mansion into a weapon, the woman who made walls attack oppressors, the mother who avenged her daughter through impossible planning. It terrified plantation owners. If Delilah could do this, spend 8 months preparing to kill 17 people in an attack that looked like an accident, untraceable, what else were enslaved people capable of? The comfortable fiction of helpless slaves was shattered. People who built houses, repaired walls, and had unrestricted access could kill in ways never seen coming. Insurance companies required inspections. Some planters hired white carpenters, while others implemented paranoid security measures. But none addressed the real problem: slavery itself. The system was so brutal that it pushed people to desperate acts. Enslaved people weren't helpless. They were intelligent, skilled, patient, and perfectly capable of striking back. Delilah's story forces uncomfortable truths. What she did was planned murder. 8 months preparing to kill 17 people. Cold calculation, no argument otherwise. But she did it after watching her daughter beaten to death for spilling tea. After 27 years of slavery. After 4 children had been taken because the legal system offered no justice, no protection, no recourse. Modern readers might recoil from celebrating this, and understandably so. What she did was horrifying. But what was done to her in grace was also horrifying. What slavery did to millions was horrifying. The question isn't whether Delilah's actions were extreme. They were. The question is, what system creates circumstances where such actions seem like the only available option? The answer: a system built on absolute brutality, where enslaved people had no legal protection, where masters could murder children with impunity, where human beings were property. Delilah didn't create that system. She responded to it, using her intelligence and skills to strike back when every other avenue was closed. Was it justice? That depends on the definition. Legal justice would have been Blackwood prosecuted for murdering Grace. That was impossible. The law didn't recognize Grace as a person with rights. It treated her as property that Blackwood had damaged. Legal justice was structurally unavailable. So Delilah created her own. She made the mansion attack the people who had killed her daughter. She turned Blackwood's celebration into a funeral. She used wasps as oppressors, used whips as weapons to inflict suffering and death. That is one form of justice. Imperfect, brutal, outside normal frameworks, but justice nonetheless. The technical sophistication of her plan deserves recognition. She was not just angry, she was brilliant. She understood architecture, entomology, timing, and human behavior. She spent 8 months executing a plan that required mastery of multiple disciplines. She cultivated wasp colonies inside the walls without anyone noticing. She constructed a trigger mechanism that worked perfectly. She timed the attack to maximize casualties. She created something that looked like a natural disaster while being entirely engineered. Her intelligence and capability directly contradicted the racist ideology that justified slavery. Enslaved people were supposedly inferior, incapable of sophisticated planning. Delilah proved otherwise. Given knowledge, time, and motivation, enslaved people could accomplish remarkable things, including elaborate revenge. Modern entomologists note that what Delilah did was theoretically possible, but required extraordinary knowledge and patience. Paper wasps can be encouraged to nest in specific locations through proper preparation. They can be triggered into mass attacks through disturbance. Multiple colonies can be coordinated if nest sites are disturbed simultaneously. The timing aligns with wasp population peaks in late June in South Carolina. Everything Delilah reportedly did was within biological possibility, which makes the story even more remarkable. It wasn't magic or supernatural. It was applied knowledge, careful preparation, and perfect execution. Intelligence defeating brutality. What happened to Grace, beaten to death for spilling tea, represents the casual cruelty of slavery. Masters could murder enslaved children for trivial reasons and face no consequences. It was not unusual, it was normal. Thousands of enslaved children died from beatings, overwork, disease, and deliberate cruelty throughout slavery's existence. Grace's death was one among many, but Delilah refused to let her daughter's death be meaningless. She transformed it into a catalyst for revenge. Remembered for generations, she made Blackwood pay the ultimate price for his casual cruelty. She turned Grace's murder into a story of resistance, inspiring others. The 17 who died at Riverwood on June 23, 1859, were not innocent victims. They were participants in and beneficiaries of slavery. They had gathered to celebrate Blackwood's political appointment, an appointment he had used to further entrench slavery in South Carolina law. They were wealthy planters who owned human beings and built their fortunes through forced labor. Some had certainly killed enslaved people or ordered such killings. Their deaths were not tragedies in a meaningful moral sense. They were consequences. Justice delivered by someone they believed helpless. The attack was designed to look like an accident, and that is significant. Delilah couldn't openly rebel. She couldn't kill Blackwood in an obvious way. She would have been caught, tortured, and executed. So she created something that appeared to be a natural disaster. This allowed her to escape blame, survive, and tell the story. It also maximized the psychological impact. If this could happen accidentally, if wasps could spontaneously organize attacks, then every plantation house was potentially dangerous. But if enslaved people were involved, as many suspected despite the lack of proof. It was even more terrifying. It meant that enslaved people could weaponize nature itself. The story spread through both enslaved and white communities after 1859. Among enslaved people, it brought hope and possibility. If Delilah could do this, what else was possible? If intelligence and patience could defeat brutality, resistance was always an option. The story inspired others to find creative ways to fight back. Among white plantation owners, it was a nightmare scenario. People trusted to build and maintain homes could be planning deaths. Every carpenter, every maintenance worker, every person with knowledge of building structures was now potentially dangerous. Paranoia increased, trust decreased. The comfortable system where enslaved people were both valuable workers and helpless property became psychologically impossible to maintain. In 1865, the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. Delilah was 49 years old. She had survived. She had outlasted the system that had enslaved her for decades. She had seen Blackwood, Margaret, and Thornton die according to her design. She had achieved her revenge and lived to see freedom. In 1871, during Reconstruction, Delilah gave an interview to a Northern journalist who was documenting the stories of formerly enslaved people. At age 55, living in Atlanta and working as a paid carpenter, she confirmed the basic facts of Riverwood. "I spent 8 months preparing that mansion to execute itself," she said. "Every detail was planned, every colony cultivated, every timing element calculated. When I pulled that rope, I knew exactly what would happen, and I would do it again." "Do you feel guilt?" the journalist asked. "For what?" "For killing the man who murdered my daughter, for killing people who profited from enslaving human beings. No, I feel satisfaction. I feel pride. I proved that enslaved people weren't helpless, that we were intelligent, capable, and perfectly able to strike back. That's what terrified them most. Not that I killed 17 people, but that I did it so skillfully they couldn't prove it was me." Delilah died in 1877 at age 61. Her obituary, published by a black newspaper in Atlanta, described her as a woman of remarkable intelligence and determination who survived slavery and built a successful career as a skilled carpenter in freedom. It did not mention Riverwood. That story was recorded separately in oral histories collected by formerly enslaved people, preserving the truth about resistance. These histories were not published widely until the 20th century, when scholars finally began to seriously study the accounts of enslaved people themselves. What can we learn from Delilah today? First, intelligence is the most powerful weapon. Delilah defeated people who held all the structural power through planning and applied knowledge. She didn't need strength or conventional weapons. She needed an understanding of architecture, entomology, and timing. She reminds us that oppressed people have always found ways to use knowledge as resistance. Second, patience can be revolutionary. She spent 8 months preparing, maintaining her cover perfectly, showing no signs, and waiting for exactly the right moment. This level of patience and self-control in pursuit of long-term goals is a model for any struggle against injustice. Third, systems of oppression create their own vulnerabilities. Slavery gave Delilah access to the mansion structure precisely because enslaved people were trusted to do skilled labor without supervision. The system's need for her skills created the opportunity for revenge. This is true of all oppressive systems. They create vulnerabilities through their own functioning. Fourth, nature can be weaponized by those who understand it. Delilah turned wasps into an army, requiring detailed knowledge of their behavior and biology. This shows how traditional knowledge and careful observation can be transformed into powerful tools. Fifth, the powerful often cannot imagine the intelligence of those they oppress. Blackwood never suspected Delilah was capable of what she did. He saw her as just a carpenter, just a slave, just a tool. His inability to recognize her intelligence was a fatal mistake. Oppressors always underestimate the oppressed. Sixth, justice sometimes comes from unexpected sources and in unexpected forms. No court would have given Delilah justice. No law protected Grace. But justice came anyway, delivered by wasps emerging from the walls, engineered by a mother who refused to accept her daughter's murder as inevitable. These lessons apply today. The specific forms of oppression have changed, but the underlying dynamics remain. Structural inequality persists. People still face systems that deny them justice, and people still find creative ways to resist, using whatever tools and knowledge they possess. The walls of Riverwood Mansion stood until 1923, when the structure was finally demolished. By then, it was decayed and abandoned, with no one wanting to live where 17 people had died. Local people said it was cursed, that you could still hear wasps buzzing inside the walls even decades later. That was psychological, not supernatural, but the psychological impact was real. The mansion became a memorial to resistance, a reminder that enslaved people could strike back in ways that could not be prevented or predicted. Modern scholars documenting slave resistance have found hundreds of cases of creative rebellion, poisoning, arson, sabotage, escape networks, and even weaponizing insects and animals. Delilah's story fits a broader pattern. She wasn't unique in fighting back, but she was unique in the sophistication of her method and the scale of casualties she achieved. The impulse to resist despite impossible odds, to use intelligence to defeat brutality, was universal among enslaved people. If you are uncomfortable with Delilah's story, sit with that discomfort. Do not rush to resolve it. Discomfort is appropriate. What Delilah did should disturb us, but what was done to her and her daughter should disturb us more. The system that made her actions seem necessary should disturb us most. This is history that does not fit neat moral categories. Delilah was both victim and killer. Grace was both a murdered child and a catalyst for revenge. Blackwood was both a successful plantation owner and a child murderer. The 17 dead were both victims of a wasp attack and beneficiaries of slavery. All of these are true, simultaneously. Moral complexity is the point. Slavery created situations where normal ethics collapsed, where victim and perpetrator, justice and murder, resistance and terrorism became impossible to separate cleanly. Delilah's story forces us to grapple with this complexity, rather than pretending it does not exist. Remember the walls that screamed. Remember the mansion that became a weapon. Remember Delilah spending 8 months cultivating wasp colonies and constructing trigger mechanisms. Remember her pulling the rope at exactly 8:47 p.m. Remember 17 people dying as thousands of wasps erupted from the walls they believed were solid and safe. Remember Grace, 15 years old, beaten to death for spilling tea. Remember that this was normal under slavery. Remember that legal justice was impossible. Remember that Delilah created her own justice when every other option was foreclosed. And remember that the fight continues. In different forms, on different battlefields, but with the same underlying struggle for dignity, justice, and recognition of full humanity. Delilah showed what is possible when intelligence, knowledge, and determination combine with righteous rage. She proved that the oppressed are never helpless if they are willing to be patient, creative, and ruthless in pursuit of justice. That is her legacy. That is her lesson. That is why we remember the carpenter who turned wasps into weapons, the mother who avenged her daughter, the woman who made walls scream. Remember Delilah. Remember Grace. Remember that resistance takes many forms. Remember that justice, however delayed, however unusual, however brutal, is always possible. The walls are always listening. The wasps are always waiting. And somewhere, someone is planning. Remember that.